everyone. Welcome back to the latest Labour CND podcast. Today, Andrew Murray is joining us as a guest, and we're going to be talking about what's coming up at next week's TUC, the Trade Union Congress, and particularly what the anti-war and peace resolutions on the agenda are. Hope you like this. If you've heard us before, you'll be familiar with the routine. And if you like what you hear, please give us a like, give us a follow, and recommend us to your friends. Okay, so let me introduce Andrew. I expect most of this audience already knows who Andrew Murray is. He's the Deputy President of Stop the War Coalition. He's got a long history of involvement in anti-war and peace issues. I've known Andrew since the late 1980s, when he joined the Committee for Peace in the Gulf, which was set up by CND and Labour CND in opposition to the war on Iraq in 1991. And we've worked together on a lot of anti-war issues since then. Nowadays, Andrew's better known as an advisor to Jeremy Corbyn during his Labour Party leadership years, and until recently, Andrew was Unite's Chief of Staff, and that makes him eminently suitable to take us through this year's TUC agenda. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you for inviting me on, Carol. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And as you say, we've got a long history of campaigning against war and imperialism, and that seems to be as important as ever today. So I'm happy to be with you.
Great. I expect you've got your eye on the big issues that are coming up at the TUC, and some of the contentious ones too, which I'm sure our audience would like to hear about. So we're looking to you for an insider's take on this year's proceedings. Let's get a start with question one. It's a simple beginning. Let's have a look at what's on the agenda of this year's Trade Union Congress, Andrew. Give us a run through on the peace and anti-war issues coming up for discussion.
Well, firstly, Carol, I should say I'm not so much an insider now as I used to be. It's now 4 years nearly since I retired as Chief of Staff at Unite. So I watch the TUC from a bit more of a distance than I used to. But it's still, of course, of central importance for the labour and trade union movement. There is, however, and perhaps this is a small point for many of your listeners, but it's as well to be aware of it, that the way the TUC is structured, the conference itself, I mean, not the organisation, larger unions have 2 motions and smaller unions 1 only, and then larger unions can put in up to 3 amendments. This has often meant in recent years that critical international issues have fallen off the agenda because a large union, like, say, Unite, or it would be true of other large unions, involved in multiple industries with multiple industrial concerns, often find they can't use one of their motions for an important international question. So in recent years, there have been rather limited opportunities to debate issues that aren't perceived as central to the industrial agenda of the major unions. And that is reflected, unfortunately, in this year's agenda. Perhaps this is something that the TUC should look at altering in some way for the future. But there are 2 motions that I think, directly speak to the international issues that face us. One is a motion which I'm sure will be passed by a huge majority of solidarity with the Palestinian people and demanding that the unions press the British government for more decisive action against the genocide in Gaza. That comes from the National Education Union, the main or the largest teaching union affiliated to the TUC. The second, which is perhaps speaks even more centrally to Labour CND's particular concerns, is a motion from the UCU, the University and Colleges Union, which is calling on the TUC to basically reverse the position it adopted 3 years ago of campaigning for an increase in military spending. And that has remained, at least formally, the TUC's policy, even though Congress House, the TUC leadership, has done relatively little to actually action it. The UCU is saying there has to be a reordering of the movement's priorities, that the projected increases in military spending, now going up to from 2% of GDP to 2.5% at the price of, more than half the overseas aid budget. Beyond that, at Donald Trump's insistence, to 3.5% on direct military spending and 5% on including military-related expenditure. Absolutely vast increases in military expenditure that cannot be separated from also the cuts that the Labour government has been proposing, or the much more limited funding increases in vital public services and welfare benefits. So this is a choice that the trade union movement has to make. And I certainly hope that most unions will get behind the UCU's motion, which, quite apart from the relative impact these different forms of spending have on working class people in this country, also means basically entrusting the British establishment, the British ruling class, if you like, which has engaged in one criminal war after another in the course of this century, no need to go back any further in history, with more weaponry. And this is simply abandoning the working class movement's responsibilities internationally.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. When I read that motion, I was wondering exactly how much opposition there will be. Perhaps it will be the case that rather than opposing the motion, it will be composited and some of the strongest meat will be edited out, as it were. It suggests, as you say, that spending for arms, higher spending for arms, is signalling approval for great power rivalry, the contentious wars that you mentioned. And it also wants to commit the TUC to reverse policy of supporting defence increases, which it's had for several years now. I think that's strong meat for the TUC. Do you agree? Do you think it is likely to be on the agenda in exactly the format that you and I are discussing it in at the moment?
Well, that's an important question. The agenda that we can see now doesn't include any amendments that might have been submitted. So it is possible that the resolution could be amended. I doubt if it can be composited with with other resolutions that are on the agenda, because there has to be some overlap in subject matter, and I don't particularly see that. But the TUC is ingenious in trying to avoid controversies getting to Congress floor, so I couldn't rule it out. And there may, of course, be amendments. The original position taken in 2022 was motivated by the GMB, a union which is, I think it's fair to say, fairly aggressive in its pursuit of higher defence spending. It was, however, supported by Unite, which has also moved to that position much more recently. Certainly, it wasn't our position when I was Chief of Staff of Unite, which was until 2021. So I would imagine that the resolution as it stands will not go through unopposed. And this is one of the divisive aspects of these sort of resolutions, in that it is motivated by a stated desire to protect or even extend employment in military industries, which is where Unite has quite a number of members, but a very small minority of Unite's overall membership. And the GMB, I think, has even fewer. But it poses that effectively in the real world, no matter what gymnastics rhetorically people may engage in, against those working in the public services, Unison, the National Education Union, PCS, the UCU, and so on. So I imagine that all those unions I've just named will support the motion if it gets to the Congress floor. The GMB, I imagine, will certainly oppose it, and Unite, I imagine there would be much more of an argument within the delegation, but as things stand, one would have to assume that they would support it as well. So it could be quite a close vote. Unlike when this was first discussed 3 years ago, the issue feels much more urgent, much more vital now, because we are seeing these vast increases in defence spending projected at a time when Rachel Reeves is having to rule out all sorts of other forms of spending increase and even push for cuts in welfare benefits, as we've seen, because of the fiscal rules laid down by the Treasury and the Bank of England and her own determination to stay within very strict limits on debt. She said that she's immovable and all of that, and so far she has been. So there are absolutely choices to be made here. And we don't want it to degenerate into a sort of sectional argument between private sector manufacturing workers and public service workers. But in the end, on this issue, the public service unions would be speaking, I think, for the generality of working class interest, even on this relatively focused budgetary question. If one looks on the larger issue of a drive to war, a war psychosis being whipped up against Russia, against China, the depths of Britain's involvement in the crises in the Middle East, then the question is all the clearer. We cannot be further arming a British state that is bent on a course of international aggression.
Yeah, very much agree with all that, Andrew. And perhaps we'll have time towards the end of the podcast to come back to one or two of the points that you raise. But what you've said leads me nicely into the next question I have for you. And that is that defence diversification, something that the GMB and Unite have been pushing, defence diversification, i.e. the transition from military jobs to sustainable, socially useful production, isn't on the agenda this year. What do you think, if anything, that signifies?
Well, it signifies, I believe, a deep scepticism within the trade union movement about the viability of defence diversification. Of course, it was much talked about in the 1970s. There were serious initiatives taken, perhaps into the 1980s. But since the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, there have been very substantial cuts in military spending until relatively recently, when that's been reversed. And no real effort was made by any government, including the new Labour government, to address the consequences. In fact, under the last Labour government, the Blair government, the Defence Diversification Agency was wound up. So I know from my own experience that members in those industries are deeply sceptical about this, because the fact is unions cannot diversify these industries on their own. This needs to be picked up politically. It is absolutely fair to say that unions need to try and drive that. But it's not a magic wand in terms of resuming, overcoming the difficulties that you have in persuading workers. Let me give an example, which may seem almost blasphemous to a CND audience, because it involves a mild criticism of the iconic Bruce Kent. But I remember a letter he wrote a few years ago in a newspaper addressing this argument of jobs. And he said, I thought rather airily, Of course, the whole argument is nonsense. If we cut nuclear weapons, this was he was talking about Trident, of course, we could generate far more jobs as teachers and health workers. Now, taken at the level of society as a whole, that is true. If you zoom in on Barrow in Furness, where the nuclear submarines are actually built, and you have thousands of skilled workers involved in their manufacture, Barrow doesn't need that many teachers and health workers, nor does it speak to someone in their 40s or 50s who's a skilled engineering worker, who really probably either doesn't or can't retrain. So there has to be a more specific focus on how we revive manufacturing, skilled manufacturing work in the places where defence or military industries are strongly entrenched. Barrow's an extreme example because there is very little else there. Other factories are more in, regions or areas where there is already possibly more a diversity of employment opportunities. But one has to deal with this in a very specific and concrete way. It requires government intervention. I think absolutely the government has a responsibility to protect the work of those workers who are in those industries, because in the end, the government is the only customer for what they produce, either directly or through licensing exports to governments elsewhere. No one's walking in off the street and buying military hardware, or if they are, it's alarming. So I do think the championing of defence diversification needs to address these concerns specifically. It's perfectly doable. The skills are transferable. Most obviously, I think, in the context of a green industrial strategy, which, alas, this government had backed away from its ambitious commitments on that to a very large extent, even before it was elected last year. So I think to get defence diversification going again as in a practical way in the trade unions where it matters, which is mainly Unite and the GMB to a very large extent, even though every trade union in Barrow would have a concern about what would happen if the nuclear submarines were simply that work was simply abandoned without any replacement. So I think that serious thought needs to be given to that, because it is the only way of overcoming this sectional split, which then leads sections of the trade union movement into supporting policies which, under other circumstances, they would never dream of it. I mean, when I was at Unite, if workers in these industries came forward and said, we want our jobs protecting, we would say, we're with you. But then they try and create geopolitical reasons for this, or the Russians are coming, or the Chinese are menacing, or it's a dangerous world, or there's terrorism and so on. And they actually then start importing the ideas of the establishment, the foreign policy priorities of the British state into the trade union movement. Not really, I think, because they've sat down and analysed it or thought about it or have sophisticated arguments, but because it seems to justify their continued employment.
I must say, I agree with many of the points you make, particularly the fact that no trade union, as opposed to government, can deal with this issue at the level it needs dealing with. But what you say brings me on to 2 points I'd like to raise with you. The first, I want to ask what your view of the defence jobs myth is. Recently, Labour CND had a podcast with Alex Gordon. I'm sure you know him from the RMT, the Rail Union. And he said that not only is it a myth that the defence industry creates high-paid, high-skilled jobs. In other words, the majority of jobs in the defence industry are neither of these things. And what's more, they are increasingly becoming either more mechanised, or taken over by AI activities. But he said it's also the case that what high-paid skilled work there is mostly carried out by professionals professional level of workers, professional class, socio-economic classes, and they don't live inside the communities that they work in, and they do not add to the local economy. What's your view of that?
Well, I think Alex is mostly right, although it can be overstated. Certainly, the number of jobs involved in military industry is relatively small. I mean, I think back to Unite, and there was probably 30 or maybe 30,000 workers employed in those industries out of a total membership of industrial membership of over 1 million. And most organised workers in those industries would have been in Unite. I think that it is also very capital intensive. The technological component of the investment in industry, as opposed to the labour component, if you like Marx's idea of the organic composition of capital, it's heavily weighted towards investment in high tech. So a lot of money doesn't create all that many new jobs. And that's even before one gets onto the fact that Trump is pressing with some success for all the United States allies to spend the defense budget increases he has insisted upon in the USA. So the idea there's going to be a jobs bonanza, I find entirely fanciful. I only disagree with Alex in saying that one cannot completely dismiss the community element. I mean, I won't dwell on the Barrow example. That is a community that is very largely dependent on one workplace, which is the shipyard that building the nuclear submarines. There are other less clear examples, but he is right that this is increasingly highly skilled professional work. With a very high degree of automated technology, very high tech, and that is where the money will go. So the idea there is a jobs bonanza coming, I just don't buy at all. The idea that it might keep in business factories that might otherwise close, that is more plausible. But again, I would see layoffs rather than extra employment forthcoming for the reasons I stated. When this comes in, it's subject to the same laws of capital investment that apply elsewhere, which is a tendency to replace living labour with machinery.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me ask you a second question. It's on the same issue, but it's a very different point. I know Unite's defence sector members are a strong influence in the union. I've been at Unite conferences, I've seen that. But I also know that some of Unite's members don't buy into this defence jobs argument. And that includes some members who are in that defence sector of the union. Okay. On the other hand, I believe it's the case that the GMB actually have very few jobs in the defence sector. And that one of the things that is driving this defence diversification argument, driving it in the wrong direction, because it is pursued most strongly by the GMB, as you suggest, is that the sort of rivalry, the membership rivalry between GMB and Unite is sometimes blamed for the lack of movement around defence diversification. How much truth do you think there is in that argument?
Well, a little bit. I mean, there is when I was at Unite, there sometimes was a fear that if we adopted, say, a policy of unilateral nuclear disarmament, which had been the policy of the Transport and General Workers Union before it merged into Unite, that could lead to an exodus of members to the GMB. It never actually happened. And of course, actually moving membership tends to be relatively rare in trade unions. There's normally other ways of dealing it. And of course, it's formally prohibited under the TUC's own own rules. But in Unite, I mean, you're right, partly because we had these two traditions, the T&G one and the engineering union one, that clashed on this point. When Len McCluskey became the first sort of united General Secretary of Unite after the transition period, he and I put a lot of effort into coming up with a position around Trident that everyone could live with. It wouldn't be necessarily anyone's first choice position, but it would be one everyone could live with. I mean, there were people in the industry who said the union as a whole has no business taking any position that impacts on our jobs at all. That is simply the responsibility of our sector. Others said we've got to stand with the T&G's position of unilateral disarmament. In the end, on Trident, which was the cutting edge of this argument at the time, I'm talking about 10 to 15 years ago, we had a position that Trident's replacement, that Trident's development was unjustifiable, couldn't be supported, and all the reasons that you and your listeners would be familiar with, but also that we had a responsibility to defend our members' jobs before any decisions were taken that simply removed those jobs. I wouldn't say everyone loved that position, but it got adopted and affirmed every time it was challenged from either direction, as it were. And that, of course, corresponded to the interests of Unite and as a whole, because that division that I put between manufacturing unions and public service unions, that division exists within Unite and the GMB, indeed. The GMB, half its members work in the public services, and I think a very small proportion of the military industries. In Unite, we have hundreds of thousands of people working in public services, and as well as many in manufacturing. So there are ways around this if you take the argument head on. But to go back to your question, I mean, of course, where there are two unions in the same factories, in the same industries, there is always a danger of people moving from one to the other. But you see, in Unite, we never let whatever policy issues we were discussing impact on our responsibility to represent our members properly at the place of work. So most people would not be interested in shifting from one union to another, but that the concern was there, and that inter-union competition can, in this as in other examples, push unions in a bad direction. I think that is true.
Thanks, Andrew. Perhaps we can come back to some of those issues raised around the defence diversification arguments in the future. Let's move on for now. Okay, as always, there are plenty of big ticket issues on the TUC agenda: the economy, the NHS, education, public services, local government, etc., etc. But one of the issues that jumped out at me, though, was concern about the continued decline in union membership. Presumably, this is tied, at least in part, to the failure to raise wages much above the level of the 2008 global financial crisis. And I would like to know what's your view of this issue, both in the world. Why are more people not joining unions? And what's your view of how it impacts on the TUC and its members?
I think the decline in trade union membership now, one has to say that is driven by quite entrenched structural factors that long predate the 2008 crash and its negative consequences, in that the most heavily organised parts of the British economy, when trade union membership was at its peak, well over 50% of the workforce in the late 1970s, it was concentrated in heavy industry, in manufacturing, in coal mining, in industries that have now either disappeared or are, at least in terms of employment, a shadow of their former selves. I mean, for example, the car industry, which, unlike some of the others I've named, still exists. The vehicle output is certainly as high most years as it was back in the 1970s, but with perhaps 10% of the workforce. So that has been a huge transition of work in the British economy from manufacturing and what we used to call basic industries, which have now migrated to other countries to a very large extent, and where they remain have been transformed by huge increases in productivity, to a service sector economy, parts of which in the public sector are relatively well organised, but much of which in the private sector unions have not been able to crack. Now, of course, there used to be what was called a trade union premium, that if you're in the union, your wages would be 4 or 5% or 10% higher than they would be if you were not in a union, insofar as comparisons could be drawn. That has definitely eroded more recently, where unions have been struggling to maintain the value of members' wages, let alone secure increases in the real value, particularly at the time of very high inflation that occurred about 2 or 3 years ago as we were coming out of the pandemic, and led, in fact, to a large number of industrial disputes, which did, I think, re-establish or remind us of the relevance of trade unions, because you had a long period, the preceding, in the 2010s, I suppose, where inflation was low. If inflation's at 2% and your employer offers you a 1% wage increase, well, that is a wage cut, but it's not one you're likely to go out on strike over. It's a real wage reduction that most people would be able to absorb, and balancing the inconvenience of that with the losses of going on strike, most people wouldn't bother. When inflation is at 10 or 11% and you're offered a 3% increase by your employer, that is much more substantial cut. And that, of course, has led to a large number of strikes just shortly after I retired, really, 2022, 2023. And that, I think, showed the importance of trade unions. But to actually grow, that would require organising initiatives, which have been attempted by a number of unions, but none of them have really turned the corner in terms of membership. They have no doubt contributed, and the situation would be worse without them, but they haven't turned a corner, and that appears to be the case in nearly all of what one might call the first wave capitalist countries, where unless there is, as say there is in Denmark, a close association between trade union membership and the welfare system, which more or less mandates union membership, then the tendency is for union membership to decline, because unions have not found a way to organise in the new industries as well as in the old, and that is even before one gets on to the quite deliberate policies of successive governments designed to make it as hard as possible to organise unions, and that was introduced, of course, under Thatcher. In this country, it wasn't reversed significantly under Tony Blair. It became entrenched during the more recent period of Tory government, and this Labour government is talking about making it a bit easier. There's a lot of business lobbying around that, but I think it will take a huge effort it would really, in my view, require a shift to sectoral bargaining in different sectors of the industry, where unions were mandated to represent all the employees for collective bargaining purposes in a given sector, no matter which the immediate employer was. The government is talking of introducing that only in the social care industry. There are a number of others that could very well benefit from it too. That might lead to a reversal of the trend you identify.
Thanks. And indeed, there's a motion on sectoral bargaining, if my memory serves, on the agenda. I think what you say about the change in the structure of employment and the structure of different economic sectors is also reflected actually in the on the TUC agenda. For instance, motions about contract workers and how badly they're paid, motions about AI, artificial intelligence, and so on. But if I may, just finally, I'd like to take this discussion in a slightly different direction. You mentioned that trade unionism was at its height in the 1970s. If my memory serves, it was around 60% of workers were unionised, something like that. And one of the impacts of that was a different composition of TU delegations to Congress with a strong activist input. Nowadays, union delegations, both at the TUC and at the Labour Party, are dominated at official level. Senior officials, general secretaries, etc., are a much greater influence on delegations and on the decisions they take. I can remember, for example, in the 1980s, when nuclear disarmament was very prominent on the agenda, and also when Labour CND was introducing the need to cut defence spending, talking to both general secretaries and lay delegation members at Labour Party conference, and finding that what the recommendations of the head office were had not been accepted. It strikes me that that's much less true nowadays, that the voting, the way in which trade unions vote, is much more dominated by the union headquarters. Do you agree with that? And if you do, what do you think it means in relations to behind the scene deals and accommodations that are more likely to influence policies now, both at the TUC and the Labour Party, than they were in the 70s and 80s?
I think I only agree with part of that. I mean, definitely there's been a change in composition of the sort of social composition of the TUC, because some of the industries, I mean, went to the 1970s, you'd see lots of coal miners there, lots of dockers, lots of steel workers, and those industries have either disappeared or massively diminished. But I'm not sure that the relative role of officials as against lay delegates has changed all that sharply. Different unions have very different traditions. The T&G, from the time of Frank Cousins onwards, which is the mid-1950s, became more democratic and officials were more accountable. The GMB, for example, has a much more official-dominated character. Some unions, for example, had executives that were composed of full-time people, like the AEU, for example, UCAT. More often, they're composed of lay delegates. I've never known a union, however, where general secretaries haven't had a lot of influence, and that was as true then as it is now. And certainly, I wasn't reporting on TUC Congresses in the 1970s. I was reporting on Labour Party conferences where, by and large, the same unions turned up. And there was definitely wheeling and dealing, backstairs deals, even brawls breaking out on the floor of conference where delegates felt votes had been miscast or whatever. I can speak with more authority about Unite and about ASLEV, the train drivers union, where I worked for a few years. And I would say there that the delegations do go through the agenda and they do make the decisions, and they can, although it is rare, overturn the recommendations of the officials. But I think the larger truth, which perhaps you're addressing, is that, of course, the life has to some extent been sucked out of these conferences because, you could feel the power in the room in the 1970s and the 1980s, the industrial and economic power. You do not feel that anymore. There are relatively few controversies because you go through long years when Labour is in opposition and the trade unions are excluded from any serious influence, so you pass the same motions again and again. The TUC does also work to minimise clashes between big unions coming to conference floor. It prefers consensus, even though it's much less exciting and interesting. But that is what they do. I think the issue of the relationship of full-time officials to lay members, it does vary a lot from one union to another, but I'm not convinced it has changed all that radically over the years I've known the movement. The strongest unions, most lively unions, are the ones that are taking industrial action, that are involved in mass campaigning and struggles in the workplace. That will then feed through to how they conduct themselves at conferences. The quiescent unions industrially will be quiescent everywhere.
Hey, thank you very much, Andre. That's been a really interesting discussion. One of the attempts that Labour CND podcast is making is to get behind the 2-minute sound bites that we endlessly listen to on social media and in the mainstream news, where politicians, trade unionists, all sorts of people from all walks of life just say exactly what they're expected to say. And there's a failure either of getting behind the issues or of allowing alternative points of view and entering. And I think your contribution has been very important in relation to that today. So thank you very much. Labour CND, unfortunately, doesn't have the same reach as the BBC or Sky, but I'm sure that the people we do reach will be really appreciative of that sort of drawing back the curtain and taking a peek behind the TUC. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Carol. It's been a pleasure.